Yeah, I'm Garth Zietsman. I have a background in psychological research and statistics. Most of my research was psychometric, so there is some relationship between the two. I am going to be chatting on inequality. I was supposed to be talking inequality and diversity, but I'm kind of dropping the diversity part. Let me start off by why equality? Why is that important? Some sort of large sections of the population would just take that for granted, but I think philosophically you need to ask why should people be equal, or should they even be treated equal? There should be at least some sort of philosophical justification for this. And one conception of fairness is equality of treatment, opportunity, or even outcome. And this may have an evolutionary basis, in that the chimps have been shown to be very concerned about getting equal shares and that sort of thing. We also seem to have, an inborn desire for status. And this has two aspects. One leads to inequality and the other would lead to equality. There's a number of experiments, I think it started off in Harvard, where they asked these students or the top graduates where they would be happy with a large increase in income, salary, if their colleagues got more, or would they prefer a lesser income if their colleagues got sort of less than them. And the big majority of them chose the lesser amount, so that they would be on top of a smaller bit of income. So the relative position was quite important to them. And this was in the elite, and it's now been replicated in all sorts of samples. And it doesn't seem to matter very much by ideology that liberals and conservatives seem to show the same sort of trend. Dems and Republicans. But there's there's a flip side of it. One is the concern for status is if you're kind of at the bottom, you're concerned, at the very least, you want to catch up. You want to squash the diversity, the variation. But there's also a strong desire to be on top, to create more inequality. People want status, and my theory was there's competition for scarce resources, or let's call it breeding resources. There's a limited one, and you're more likely to breed if you can control more resources and have better status, that sort of thing. So the whole drive for some sort of status ladder comes from the need to breed, or the desire to breed. That's my theory. I can't say it's been proven. Another thing about inequality is that there is obviously some sort of misuse of power. Every now and again somebody grabs some power. A bully comes in, I don't know, Genghis Khan or something. They establish a dynasty and they have some sort of unfair advantage, which they pass on. They sort of fix the rules to suit themselves, and you get this sort of perpetuation. That sort of thing does happen. So that's one source of inequality, and it's generally regarded as uncool by those at the bottom. And then there's a whole lot of philosophy behind this, sort of egalitarian or universality principle. As it's the only acceptable and consistent way to accommodate competing political claims. So that you've got to treat everyone the same way, otherwise no one's going to get an agreement. It's also a basis behind rational economic theory, maths, that sort of thing. You must have some sort of consistency, treat each economic agent is the same. It's a strong egalitarian presumption in economic theory. It's beyond like Kant's dictums. Now, one is like to treat people as ends, not as means. That's the sort of morality behind it, he said. Because his argument was that we are rational creatures, and as such we need to be treated as rational creatures, as somebody could give you a reason, demand a reason, so you've got to treat them as an end, not as a means. And he also had this view of that any sort of moral that you regard, any sort of rule, you must make it universal, that it applies to everyone and everywhere. And these kind of things are often behind the sort of need for inequality, equality of treatment and opportunity at the very least. More latterly, it's starting to become behind a demand for equality of outcome. Nietzsche, on the other hand, didn't go along with this. He said, you don't want universal morality because people have different interests, different things in their best interest. Even men and women, he said, they would have morality is there to serve your interests, to help you thrive, to help you get power over the conditions which determine your life. And those are different for different people in different states. It's different for a master and it's different for a slave. People all over the place. So you said you don't actually want, what you want is various moralities. You don't want an overall one that just applies to everyone and flattens everything. Nassim Taleb, you may know of him from The Black Swan, or Fooled by Randomness. He sort of argued that the problem with universal laws is that there are abstractions that cut out all sorts of very important local conditions and interests in that. And when you apply a universal law, for example, it flattens out different preferences. So to have a law that applies to everyone, you may have to ignore a range of preferences and limit them. So it only sort of satisfies a certain range of outcomes and preferences. So you get a kind of leveling, squashing of your preferences. It limits you to a smaller set of options, in which case it says that can either just make things worse than they could have been, or not as good as they could have been, or it could be disastrous in some circumstances. Then I had a question here. What determines worth or rights? Why should we be equal? It's like Kant came up, he says we are rational beings. And he said, he maybe had the assumption that we're equally capable of being rational. You know, it's like we have a soul. It's, in this case, like a rational soul. And everyone has the same size soul or power of soul or something. So are we equally rational? Do we have the same ability? Is ability relevant to whether you have rights or the amount of rights that you have? Sometimes we deny this. I mean, like the retarded often don't have the same rights as we do. Is it a soul? Do we have a soul? I mean, it must be something that every person shares in equal measure, and that often is behind the assumption, particularly on leftist side, that we come sort of fitted with equal capacities and potential. Okay, so now why is there inequality? Well, I mentioned earlier status desire, which is the other side of envy. People want to be higher than others, want to be at the top of the ladder, competing with the Joneses, and they strive to make it so. And it would be unusual if you didn't get some inequality that came from that. There is a seizing of power and persistence of privilege does exist. You know what the left go on about. It does exist, at least to some extent. I know I sort of read recently a book on ancient Greek achievement. And I was struck very often, they didn't like the aristocrats at first. They moved towards the more democratic system. And the funny thing is that the aristocrats had a way of finding themselves into those positions of power anyway. They were quite persistent. Even in the French Revolution too, quite a lot of the guys after the revolution were aristocrats. So they managed to persist in power. Now, is this due to power games on their part? Maybe they learned the game better, they're more inspired to play. Or do they have the right stuff? They're made of better stuff, which, I think the root of the word aristocracy means superior or something like that, or right to rule. But there's some connection to that. Research I've seen recently shows that there's a general status factor. When we measure socioeconomic status, usually break it up into income, education, job status, all sorts of other things. It's been found that there is actually all of these things correlate extremely highly, and there seem to be what we call in stats a sort of latent variable underlying all of these. They seem to have a single factor in common, and it makes up for quite a lot of the variance of all the specific details like wealth and education and so on. What's interesting about the general factor is it's more persistent than the outcome persistence between parent and child. So if you correlate, for example, socioeconomic status between parent and child, you get some sort of correlation. It's high, but it's not huge. But we say if you look over multiple generations and multiple children, and you can see a persistent general factor that's much stronger than that we can estimate just by correlating parent and children, which is, in other words, they underestimate the extent to which status is passed on. They found also it's steady across time and social system. So the same sort of people or families will tend to end up at the top, doesn't matter what system you end up. It also strongly related to productivity variation, in that those who are most productive tend to end up at the top. We chatted recently about the Price's law, which basically says that half of all production is produced by the square root of the number of people producing. That's a very rough approximation of something called Lotke's curve, which is a kind of inverse power law. It found that, for example, artists or scientific papers, that the vast majority of scientists that have published only one paper. And then there's a big drop to 2 papers and so on and so on. And the number of papers published by scientists does fit Price's law quite well. It's not an exact fit, and some fields maybe it's not quite as extreme, but in general terms, that kind of extreme inequality in production is the rule, not an exception. The explanation for why it looks like that and not like a normal bell curve is that the achievement requires quite a lot of elements. It may require some intelligence, it may require some work capacity, willingness to work, some luck, that sort of thing. And when you multiply these factors together, you get something that, even though all the components have a sort of bell curve distribution, which is symmetrical on both sides, if you multiply them together, you get this huge skew. Another reason is, like if there's even a small probability difference, say somebody's playing tennis, the difference between the players in their skill might be, the difference in the probability of winning any particular point might be small. And if you sort of add the points up, say if this probability of winning this point is only say 55% or 52% as opposed to 48, but winning 2 points in a row or 3 points in a row, it starts becoming more to the advantage of the guy that has the small advantage. So when you get to the end of the game, it's not like 52-48 anymore, it's more like 60-40. When you get to the end of a set, it's even more end of a match, winning tournaments, it grows and grows. So that's why Roger Federer has got 20 Open wins, and most tennis players are never going to win an Open. Okay, we also find it's highly correlated with IQ, although IQ is not the only factor that goes into this. Conscientiousness is another big factor, but conscientiousness is also heritable. IQ and so a number of other factors that go into this are also heritable, which suggests that status is, well, they've looked at status and heritability, and the heritability is pretty high. But is it why is it heritable? Is it because people just pass on their privilege, or they pass on their genes? And to what? It's probably a mix of both, but to what extent? Luck also plays a role in inequality. I've looked at, for example, looked at a bunch of new tunes that came on the market, and they asked experts to say which ones were good and which ones were bad and so on, and rank order them in some sort of quality index and how well they'll do. And it's found that the songs that they saw first got a sort of better boost, and there were other judges that the judges didn't all see them at once. They saw them in some sort of sequence. And the songs that were seen first by the first judges, or judged well by the first judges, were like, got passed on. There was a snowballing effect, and those took off. But the point is that they found in different samples, when they fed the songs in random order, it really did depend on which one came first. It's not really the quality of the song so much. And overall, the effect of luck was about half the effect, if not more. So luck does play quite a role in inequality. So I'm just saying genes do play a role, but how much of a role is still, I'm not quite sure. There's also saying, now your genes, you didn't pick your genes. People say you got them by luck, either bad or good luck. So you don't deserve your status, both your bad status and your good status. Now that is true. But on the other hand, your parents did pick. They picked the partner they were willing to breed with. And to some extent they, say, well, am I going to breed with an idiot or a genius? And that plays some role in the outcome. Am I going to breed with somebody who's hardworking or a lazy slob? And so they have some responsibility for what they've passed on. And also, like parents are very concerned about doing well for their children. Why shouldn't they want to give them an advantage? So even though you don't deserve it, your parents might get some credit or blame. I'm not sure how relevant that is. I'm just throwing that out there. Okay, how unequal are we? Well, we know about the Gini coefficient. I'm not going to go into the technical side of how much, whatever, what percentage owns what percentage of the wealth. We've talked about online about what nonsense that is, especially notwithstanding Oxfam's rubbish about the thing. But notwithstanding that, there is a fair amount of inequality out there. It's that there are, the top earners do earn quite a large slice of the annual GDP, a small percentage of people. And there is, just like there's this huge prices law in terms of production, there's also this prices law in terms of income and wealth, material position, so on. And I imagine some more intangible aspects of status. So, but what do we do about it? Is it an issue? Is it a problem? Now, if you're on the left, I mean, it's the problem. If often I say one of the distinguishing factors of left and right is that the right don't think it's much of a problem, or they don't worry about it so much. They're prepared to tolerate it to some extent, and they think it's normal. The left do not. They think it must be a reflection of power abuse. The fact that power abuse exists can often lead you to just assume that that's the only factor out there. It's easy to see. It comes to mind. It's availability heuristic. You say, okay, because this exists, every bit of inequality must be due to some sort of discrimination along the way. Also say, is it a problem in terms of the effects? So it could be just a reflection of abuse, a reflection of discrimination. Some say that when you start getting great inequalities, you're going to start getting concentration of power, and that's going to be a problem down the road. And therefore, that's why you should bring it back. Again, often leftists. It may also, I go back, it's a reflection of a power concentration, except those in power intend to often make rules. Your talk this morning saying when they make rules to fit themselves, like central banks and business rules. So it can cause concentration of power and could be a reflection of it. We're inclined to say, like FMF and co, are inclined to say what matters is not inequality, but your absolute wealth. How well off are the poor? Are they getting better? It doesn't really matter that there are people richer than them. What matters is your absolute standard of living. Is that improving? Well, yeah, that I'm inclined to say that's what should matter, but I also recognize that people are very interested in where they are in the pecking order. It does matter to them. Another issue is, again, this is an empirical issue, but I don't really know the answer, is what is the relationship between inequality and economic growth? There are some saying that great inequality squashes economic growth. Other theorists say that it's actually some sort of inequality is necessary for economic growth. We've had a look at it. I sort of bounced the numbers and seen it doesn't seem to be any correlation at all. And even Paul Krugman sort of doubts it. He says he can't see any relationship in economic inequality and future growth. I did a survey show that when they asked people how unequal do you think the country is? Well, generally they think it's much more equal than it in fact is. And furthermore, they want it to be even more equal than they think it is. But when you ask them about specific solutions, specific measures, like redistribution or affirmative action, there's almost no support for it or great disagreement. So people would say, okay, it's the same thing where you want to sort of reduce the government budget. There's lots of agreement about saying we should, but not much agreement about what we should cut. Personally, I think you can make a good argument. We should really tackle real privilege, the hijacking of rules, and so on. But the trick is to identify the real thing from some sort of natural inequality. We shouldn't be quick to assume that productive potential or preferences when we assess outcomes. We can't just say that if there's an inequality of outcome, or what we call disparate impact, it must be the result of discrimination. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that at least some of the inequality is not due to discrimination. Okay, now solutions, as we heard from, if you want like greater safety, people sort of underestimate the costs, the opportunity costs or direct costs of it, and like that, solutions to inequality also have a cost. Each solution has a cost. One may be maldistribution of resources. When you start moving resources away from the productive, again, there might be arguments from left and right about are they more productive or not, and move it towards the less productive, you're going to get a restriction of growth on that. The solutions will be opposed against the will of many. That's a cost. As I mentioned earlier, the abstraction involved, the abstractions, the reduction of the range of choices. There's a kind of leveling going. When you want like absolute equality, pretty much everyone's going to be the same. You're going to assume equal interests, equal talent. You know, when you want quotas, for example, like in rugby, we assume that, for example, blacks are just as interested in playing rugby as white Afrikaners are. And so therefore they should be represented in the same sort of, in the ratio, in population ratio. But that it just doesn't hold up. It's just like you're ignoring the interests of many, many people when you do that sort of thing. So that in turn leads to sort of the loss of self-actualization, your sort of personal welfare. There's a massive loss of welfare when you try all this leveling out. Another thing is diversity. The argument for diversity in businesses is that it's supposed to increase the range of point of view, to raise creativity and productivity and that sort of thing. But the point is that the leveling will just flatten it all out, and it undoes the very point of having the diversity in the first place. So it's almost it is a contradiction. These costs increase exponentially with the degree of equality aimed for. It's not a linear assumption. It just goes up. You might get some bang for your buck from a little bit of wealth transfer and welfare, but it reduces the inequality a little bit. But if the more ambitious you start getting, the more nasty the effect, the more extreme the measures you have to go to. And I think at the end, when you get to the most extreme, you must end up with force and violence. And it won't, and in spite of that, it's not going to be effective. You still won't end up with equality, absolute equality. I guess there are moderate methods that go some way to alleviate inequality. I don't think they'll do a great bit. They might, on principle, we may be opposed to it, or you might say, well, like, who was it? I think Hayek was tolerant of some sort of welfare system. So some libertarians are. There's a group called Bleeding Heart Libertarians who are for a welfare system. So to some extent we might go on with some of these moderate measures. I don't think they'll make a big difference, but we could look at some sort of cost-benefit analysis for those libertarians or utilitarians here. So you might have a little bit of redistribution, social insurance. The big one might be revoking hijacked rules. The what is the term? Crony capitalism. Tackle that. I guess that's pretty much all I can cover on that now. Thanks.
Just say it again.
It again?
This sounds like a pataphysical problem. Do you know the definition of
Pataphysics?
It's the study of solutions for problems that don't exist.
You're one of those who feel inequality is not a problem.
Garth, as usual, wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. On conference after conference, I've always thought you've always been the best speaker and always voted for you the best speaker. I really strongly suggest you move on to PowerPoint so we can see the points that you're presenting, all very important and very interesting next time. Okay, okay, that's not my question, that's a suggestion. Okay. The question is this, about inequality. I've heard from Eva, and you've said more or less the same thing. It really shouldn't matter morally. It shouldn't matter that somebody's earning or doing better than you as long as you've got enough to live a happy life. And I agree with that. With the one proviso that I've heard over and over again from people like Gordon Peterson and so forth, they said one of the biggest predictors of violent crime is inequality. And they say if you've got a poor black township, say Alexander next to Samson, when the black youths see the riches of the white youths in Samson, it drives them to violence, and not against the rich white people, but against each other. And he says the reason is that they're both trying to assert male status and rise up in the male hierarchy. The rich people can do that with the BMWs and the this and that and impress the women. The black youths can't do that. So the only way they can do that is by turning to violence, which also increases their status. What do you say to that?
I think it's very plausible, and I actually haven't seen the stats that you mentioned. If Jordan Peterson's mentioning, there's probably something behind them. I think it's a rather plausible explanation, assuming such a correlation exists. As I say, I personally haven't seen it.
He says it's as good as anything you get.
As the presentation, he was blaming Trevor because he told me the top 10 TED Talks, none of them had a PowerPoint presentation. And ever since then, I haven't used them.
I think the issue with inequality might be a little bit more subtle in that I think it has a lot to do with whether people think that their effort is futile, that there's no hope of getting out of their poverty. Right, when they look at rich people, and that often happens when the inequality it's not as a result of free enterprise and the effort people put in and so on. People are quite happy that the CEOs earn more and managers earn more than workers and so on. It seems logical to them. But what does annoy them is when there is a structural problem in what you call crony capitalism. When there's an elite that captures a lot of the economic activity. Right. And they become rich, not by merit, but because of special interests and cronyism. I think that might be a large.
Actually, it's quite subtle. And I looked at when I first started seeing accusations that, or claims that inequality will cause more political strife, and I kind of looked at the data and I said, actually, it's. On average, it's the reverse, that quite unequal societies are often less violent. And a history prof friend of mine sort of told me that it's often the case is while there was a lot of inequality, there's not that much violence. When you get violence coming, when you suddenly get this release, like glasnost, for example, in the Soviet Union, or the end of apartheid, And when their lives start getting better and they start aspiring to stuff and the pressure cooks up and they start competing, with the sort of violently compete for status and that sort of thing, that's when, often when the inequality is starting to lessen, that's where you get a big burst of violence. Did you?
I think I preempted you by waving, so go for it.
It occurred to me that the inequality that you're talking about is between individuals in society.
Yes.
But one of the things that I found very interesting some time ago, when probably through the FMF or other publications, I gathered that there was a very high correlation between economic freedom and the size of businesses, and that a country like Japan, for example, which had a very vibrant economy and economic growth rate at that time in the 70s or 80s, the dominant business size was less than 50 employees. Whereas in South Africa, we had business being dominated by a few big corporations. And that imbalance, or that kind of inequality in terms of between businesses and their size, might be another interesting angle to take.
I think it's quite subtle again. It depends why they're so big, because I've seen some data saying that bigger firms are actually are much more productive. They create more GDP, but if of course they're state-owned enterprises, they may be big, but they're not. They're not driven to keep their market share. Well, not driven to keep it via performance, but they get it through the sort of rent seeking and that sort of thing. Sorry, Colin.
It's always astounded me that we celebrate inequality in every single aspect of our lives. Not just acknowledge it, we celebrate it. From sport to art, novelists who you'd think were the very last people who would be in a competition, except the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is a competition to show who's the best novelist, which just seems quite contradictory to me. We celebrate it in every single way in debating societies. And so why we suddenly have a problem with inequality when it comes to...
When you say we, I'm not sure all
with so many people, what you hear it all the time. It's an absolute knee-jerk reaction on the media. We need more equality.
Leon's made this point, is that programs like the Lifestyles and the Rich and Famous are extremely popular. And as you say, we celebrate inequality, even in wealth.
Well, if you take football.
And the rich people are superstars, Bill Gates.
But suddenly in one area of life only, which seems to be income or money, we deny the existence of a huge range of different capabilities. And very poor people will go to football matches in England and celebrate the fact that Wayne Rooney or Mickey Rooney, I think it's Wayne Rooney, earns quite so much money, and that they will never get a chance to play for Manchester United, and they don't seem to be resentful about that. And I've noticed that people who argue for equality, it's never for themselves. They argue for others, but for themselves they would like a position of inequality because they would like to be more famous and have greater time on the talk show and greater media space. And they have careers of aspiration.
But it's avenues into business, avenues towards as Eva said, these inequalities are actually inspiring. You want to get there yourself. Why not? If somebody else has done it and you think it can be done, it inspires you to go for it.
I happened to see a title of a book this morning at a nearby market, which I thought summarized the whole social justice movement in a few words. It was called Saving Fish from Drowning. And just to finish my point, Colin kind of preempted it a little, but I would say that inequality is of the lowest possible interest to a libertarian grouping. I would be interested to know how many people here think inequality is at all an issue.
Well, it became a big issue when Oxfam, every year they release the same rubbish which we tackle in the same way, and it becomes an issue.
I think it's an issue for Jordan Peterson's reasons.
Okay, awesome.
Every year
Leon?
I write a
Sorry.
column about Oxfam, so
Yes, you mentioned you've done studies and there's no correlation between the level of inequality and the level of violence. Now that is parallel, horizontal stuff comparing different levels of inequality, so-called, because my view is this doesn't measure inequality. By every objective criterion of equality, life expectancy, access to healthcare, access to painkillers, motorised transport, housing, safe water, absolutely every objective criterion other than the Gini coefficient, which is the odd one out, by all other measures of the human condition, equality has been increasing spectacularly. So the world has never been remotely as equal as it is now.
Yes, I neglected to mention.
Now the question then is that if inequality has anything to do with the level of violence, then the level of violence in the world ought to be plummeting. Because the world has never been more equal. And is that in fact the data? That's point one. Point two is, you said that there's no necessary motivation from inequality, and I've seen this argument and never liked it.
No,
but I do
sorry, say again, no necessary.
Of being motivated by inequality. I know that some conservatives argue inequality is a good thing,
yes,
because it motivates people who don't. Now, I've never liked that argument and I've never really thought about it, but I do want to ask you this. If everyone is equal by some measure, nobody's ever told us how you would measure that, but let's assume we look at all of the indices and all of the variables and everyone has the same score, 100 units. Then why would anyone put any effort into anything if it makes no difference to the outcome?
Well, that's one of the arguments against welfare. It stifles in with the will to work.
But what about the fact that there's more equality than ever? Now, has that resulted in a reduction in anything else? Violence, conflict?
Yes. Well, there is, coincidentally, there has been a reduction in violence. I don't know if there's a causal connection. I did read Better Angels of Our Nature in depth, but I may have forgotten that little piece. So I'll have another look and see if I know.
There's a book called The Spirit Level, which some of you may have seen, which tries to tackle the question of the correlations in different societies. Examines the correlations in different societies between inequality and such matters as violence, ill health, and so on, and comes out with predictably pseudo-socialist conclusions, which have been the subject of attack but need to be thought about, I think, quite hard. The second question I would suggest to people here, that I'm not sure, is that the level of inequality in society may be a measure of the level to which rent-seeking and what do you call it, rule capture. Rule capture is operative in society in order to produce that consequence, and that would lead to the notion which Ivo, who's not here, who's not here at the moment, talked earlier about, the question of the extent to which people's lives would be better still were it not for those factors that are positively correlated in terms of...
Those factors are there. I think the problem is unpacking that, distinguishing them from, say, the genetic differences.
Yeah.
Because they go in the same direction, you see. Very often the people that have the genes to be more productive are often the ones fiddling with the rules. And so it takes some tricky experimenting to disentangle them somewhere. To what extent? But I think it's not difficult to identify a rule that's been tweaked to benefit somebody. And we don't really need to do away with rent-seeking rules, for example. We can tackle those. I think they're fairly easy to identify.
So I do think that inequality is evidentially interesting.
To some extent.
I don't think that even libertarians can dismiss it as a matter of no consequence, because from an evidential point of view, it may produce all sorts of conclusions that are interesting to libertarians. The third thing is that libertarians should not be, strictly speaking, debating inequality at all, save to dismiss it for the very reasons that I tried to suggest yesterday, because you engage in utilitarian calculi all over the place, when I would venture to suggest libertarians in the pure form are concerned with freedom. I set up yesterday, and I don't think it's been refuted, that there is a fundamental dissonance between liberty on the one hand and equality on the other. Equality requires, or imperatives towards equality require regulation, imperatives towards liberty require exactly the opposite. And that's always going to create the dissonance.
I agree.
So the notion that this group of fine people here would be egalitarians would be surprising to me.
But the point is, part of their moral philosophy does assume some sort of equality, in which you treat each person like you want to be treated yourself. You know, you don't interfere with their liberty.
That's the egalitarian
Yes.
principle of
Okay, this is
respect.
becoming a one-on-one
Sorry.
discussion.
Okay.
Garth, thank you very much.